so we can share this presentation with anyone not able to make it today. So yeah, again, thank you everyone for coming today to talk about Peecycling in Franklin County, Mass. We're really glad to have you all here. And for folks as you join, we just ask that you put in what town you're calling in from today in the chat so we can get a sense of our geographic distribution here. And we'll start off with some introductions of who from the Rich Earth team is here. And then we'll get into some of the details about Peecycling broadly, and then in Franklin County specifically. So I'm Julia Kavicki. I'm Rich Earth's Education Director. And then here we also have Arthur, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure thing, yeah. I'm Arthur Davis, and I'm the Operations Director at Rich Earth. So I do a lot of the kind of organizing and coordinating around around our community scale urine recycling program.
Great. And we also have Tatiana, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Sure, I'm Tatiana Schreiber, and I am the Social Research Director at Rich Earth. So I'm involved with kind of thinking through what sort of research we want to do with people and communities around their thinking around the use of urine, diverting urine from waste streams and using it as a fertilizer. And that involves a lot of interviews and conversations with farmers and everybody else involved with the different aspects of infrastructure that need to change in order to make this happen.
Great, thanks, Tatiana. So in this presentation, I'll give you sort of a broad overview of what and why we're talking about Peecycling, what that means. And then I'll go into sort of how our community scale program here in Brattleboro or in the Windham County, Vermont area has worked for the past decade. And then we'll shift gears and talk about what it might look like to bring a program like this to somewhere in Franklin County. And we're really excited to talk about this with all of you. We know there's been a lot of movement in the ecological sanitation sphere, from compost toilets to urine recycling at different scales in the valley. And we're really excited to try to support the growth of a new community scale program somewhere there as well. So throughout the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them as we go, but we'll also have time for discussion at the end as well. So to get started, we like to first kind of take a step back and think about what's currently happening with wastewater system, which we sometimes call the flush and forget system. Often we don't think about where our poo and pee go once we put them in our water flushing toilets and send them away. But in reality, we know there's no such place as away. These nutrients often end up traveling downstream and causing problems where they go. So our sewer and septic systems were designed originally to remove organic matter and pathogens. And when functioning properly, they can do that, and they can do it well. But they often still release nutrients, pharmaceuticals, hormones, microplastics, and a wide range of other emerging contaminants, especially when our human waste is combined with industrial wastes and other sources of waste into one stream. So in our watershed, both in Brattleboro and then in Franklin County, we're all connected to the Long Island Sound watershed through the Connecticut River. And so a vast majority of the nutrients from our human waste ends up traveling down the river and accumulating in the Long Island Sound, where it causes nutrient pollution problems. So a fair amount of our nutrient recycling efforts in our area have been actually funded through the Long Island Sound Futures Fund for our efforts to help prevent this nutrient pollution in the Sound. And this image shows sediment traveling down the river and accumulating in the Sound, but is a good kind of depiction of what's also happening with our slightly less visible nutrients. So when our nitrogen and phosphorus, which are primarily the nutrients of concern when we're talking about nutrient pollution, and really nitrogen in the coastal areas in the Long Island Sound, when they travel downstream, they end up fertilizing harmful algal blooms. And these blooms are an increasing problem around the world, especially with climate change, as warmer waters lead to more beneficial conditions for them to occur. And they can have a wide range of ecological effects, from deoxygenating the water, which results in mass fish kills, to producing neurotoxins that can accumulate in shellfish. So it's kind of really not a great end result for what's happening to the nutrients that our bodies produce. So we think of this all as part of what we consider to be a linear nutrient flow, or a broken cycle. So at every step along the train of what's happening with our nutrients in our sort of conventional paradigm, we're having damaging environmental and societal effects. So on the one end of the line, to produce the nutrients that we use to fertilize our food, a lot of these nutrients are extracted through rather extractive processes, produced through extractive processes. So for nitrogen fertilizer, it's largely produced through the Haber-Bosch process, which is a highly energy-intensive process that contributes somewhere around 1 to 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions to produce the nitrogen fertilizer. And then phosphorus fertilizer is largely mined in Morocco and a few other reserves. And many people say that we're approaching peak phosphorus and we have a very limited amount of this nutrient. And it's mined in sometimes unjust and human rights abusive kind of situations. So not very great from that perspective either. So then once we've procured these nutrients through whatever means they're procured, we use them to fertilize our food, which we then eat and use to grow and sustain our bodies. And then a vast majority of the nutrients that are not needed for our DNA and other bodily processes, we excrete largely through our urine and to some extent through our poo as well. And we often flush those nutrients in large amounts of clean potable water in our toilets. So we've estimated that just to flush urine alone in the United States, we waste around 900 billion gallons of clean potable water every year. So that's a huge amount of water resources we could be conserving, especially with climate change causing more drought conditions across the US. Water is increasingly precious. And then we send that small amount of waste and large amount of water into wastewater systems that are increasingly overburdened by growing populations and underfunded infrastructure. This is an example of a recent report card that our wastewater infrastructure received from an association that comes out with these report cards every year, and they gave it a D+ for kind of ability to deal with the amount of wastewater we're sending it. So not kind of great on that end either. So here at Rich Earth and at many other places around the world, and perhaps in your own backyard, instead of considering this linear nutrient flow, we reconnect the dots to what we call the food nutrient cycle so that we can reclaim our waste as a resource and fertilize abundance in our communities instead of contributing to pollution downstream. So here at Rich Earth, we love to share the fact that we calculated in the early days that every day the average human body produces enough fertilizer to grow the wheat required to bake 1 loaf of bread. And I think this is just a nice way of visualizing the potential for reciprocity between ourselves and the land, where the land can feed us what we need to sustain ourselves in a day, and we can then return those nutrients to the land to continue to grow more food and produce in perpetuity. So just a few spotlights of other examples of peecycling around the world to kind of show the context of this movement and where other people are doing it in different ways. One example is from South Central Niger, which is one of the largest urine fertilizer education projects I know of, where it was a farmer-to-farmer education project where they trained around 3,000 primarily female farmers to use urine as a fertilizer for their subsistence farms. And growing food for their families largely. And an interesting thing from this project is that the folks leading the project work with local religious leaders and other community leaders to come up with the idea of renaming urine so that it could be more socially acceptable and kind of transition from being a waste product in people's minds to a fertilizer product. So they renamed it Oga, which in the Igbo language means the boss. I think it's kind of an interesting example of a community-based approach to fertilizer implementation. Another example is the Swiss Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, or AVOG, which has kind of been the grandmother institution of urine recycling research and technological innovation. And they've been working on urine diversion and source separation for decades and inspiring other researchers around the world to start their own research programs looking into this. And they now actually have a spin-off company called Vuna that's designing building scale urine treatment and processing systems and installing them in large buildings, including the European Space Agency, most notably. And their process produces this fertilizer product called Urine that they actually sell at a profit to gardeners in Europe, which is kind of an interesting business model to think about. And then over in France, the idea of urine diversion has really been catching hold recently as the Seine River is increasingly polluted by the rising population in the city. And so the water agency there has recognized the value of urine diversion at a city scale, to the point that they now subsidize up to 80% of urine collection projects of new development projects that incorporate urine collection. And so they have some large projects coming down the pipeline because of this funding. And then over here in the US, there are many other examples of organizations working at different aspects of the circular sanitation movement. While Rich Earth is unique in our community scale Peecycling approach, there are portable toilet companies and organizations working on regulatory and policy change, and kind of all kinds of different perspectives. So we're really kind of trying to help grow all of these different aspects of the movement in our country as well. All right, so I'll shift gears a little bit and now get into some of the details of the science about why focus on urine recycling specifically. So in these charts, you can see that over on the far left, urine makes up a small sliver of the total volume of wastewater. It's about 1% of the total volume, but it contains a vast majority of the nitrogen and phosphorus. So by doing a relatively small act volume-wise of diverting urine at the source, we can have a relatively big impact on preventing that downstream nutrient pollution, and also on producing a local sustainable fertilizer source to farmers. But on the far right, you'll see that it does contain about half of the micropollutants. And what this means is really the pharmaceuticals in urine, that the extra drug compounds or caffeine from coffee we drank that come out in our urine. And so this is a really big question that Rich Earth has been dedicated actually to researching from the early years. So I think it's important to first think about what happens to those pharmaceuticals when we flush them in our linear paradigm. In addition to it being a linear model for our nutrients, it's a linear flow for our pharmaceuticals. So when we flush our urine, a lot of the compounds that are carried in it end up accumulating in aquatic ecosystems and having deleterious effects on the life that lives there, everywhere from fish physiology changes to behavioral changes, and generally impacts that ramify up the food chain. So that's kind of not a great end result for the pharmaceuticals in our urine. So in contrast, when we reclaim urine as a fertilizer, we're helping protect those aquatic ecosystems from these compounds, and also potentially giving them a chance to break down in the soil. But this kind of raises some new questions about what the effects on the soil health might be, and whether or not these compounds are accumulating in crop tissue. So this is actually something that Rich Earth researched for 6 years in collaboration with the University of Michigan, the University of Buffalo, and the Hampton Roads Sanitation District. And they looked at the fate of these pharmaceutical compounds in the groundwater, in the soil, and in the crop tissue. And what they found is that they're only present at very, very small amounts in the parts per billion range in the crop and soil. And this is lower than the levels that are set by California for their drinking water standards, is kind of one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is they calculated that you'd have to eat a pound of urine fertilized lettuce every day for 1,000 years to then get back the same amount of caffeine that's in a cup of coffee, which is kind of the worst case scenario, because caffeine is the most common drug found in human urine, perhaps unsurprisingly. So we don't think it's a huge human health risk for these reasons, but we are continuing to research it, especially around the potential long-term soil health effects, because if we have reason to suspect that it might be soil microbes helping to break down these compounds, we want to know what the effect of them doing that may be, and just to learn more about the ecology of this process. All right, so there are two main scales to think about urine recycling at. One is the home scale, which some of you may be familiar with already, where you can just collect your own urine and use it safely in your garden without treatment. But what we're gonna be talking about is urine recycling at the community scale, which involves slightly more thinking about logistics of the transport and movement of the urine, and then also definitely requires treatment, specifically pasteurization is the main method, or you can also use storage as a method to treat the urine so that it's safe to use on a farmland in a public context. So now we're going to kind of walk through what a community scale urine recycling project looks like in Brattleboro, and then what it could look like potentially somewhere in Franklin County. So our program here in Windham County, Vermont, has been going for a little over a decade now. It was founded back in 2012, and it's the first and largest program of its kind, though we're now working to support other people getting programs like this going across the country. And it serves as a platform for the research that we do, which is both social research, as Tatiana was describing, and also agricultural and technical research. And we're now at a scale of collecting about 12,000 gallons of urine every year, which since 2012 has allowed us to conserve about 2.3 million gallons of clean water that would have otherwise been used for flushing toilets. It's kind of a way to imagine the potential impact that we've had through diverting urine in dry, waterless systems. So now we're going to walk through what we talk about as the 4 steps of our community program, which are collection, transport, treatment, and then farm application. So for urine collection, there are 3 main ways that we collect urine in our program. One is through these urine collectors and depots, which I'll show you more about shortly. The other is through installations in both home and public businesses. And the third is through our urine diverting portable toilet business. And for all of these methods, a big part of collection is really about growing a community of people who understand and are interested in becoming part of something new. And so doing a lot of community engagement and outreach work, and having public forums for people to share their concerns and ask questions and kind of come along the journey with you is a really big part of what collection means in your community. So for the urine collector method, which is kind of the easiest way to get started with community urine collecting, we have these portable urine collectors, which are basically a 2.5 or 5 gallon jug connected to a funnel through some watertight plumbing fittings that we produce. And you can just pee into that container until it's full, and then unscrew the funnel and screw on a cap and bring it to the urine depot, which is a centralized location that has a vacuum pump in it to pump out the urine in your container. And then you go back home with your empty container and kind of keep going in that way. And we have a logbook at our urine depot, which is critical urine recycling infrastructure, because our urine donors enter how much they've been donating into the logbook and are then eligible to compete in our annual piss-off competition, where we celebrate our most prolific donors and kind of have a fun way of encouraging people to continue contributing to our program. And so these urine collectors are largely accessible. You can use something like a nun's cap if you want to sit to pee. You can pee into that and then pour it into the funnel or pee straight into it. There are a number of different options there, but that's kind of the easiest low cost entry point for collecting urine. And we've actually started selling these kits on Etsy so that people across the country can access them. Which has been really interesting to see folks from, I think something like 30 different states have now bought these to use in their own bathrooms and home gardens. And it's just a nice kind of watertight, largely odorless collection method. This is a cross section of what the depot looks like. You can see the vacuum chamber here that pumps out the urine from the user interface. So it's a largely contact-free experience in terms of there's no pouring of urine or potential for splashing, which is quite important for from a public health perspective, and also just user friendliness. And then the urine is collected in these large tanks behind a wall. So then our second method of collecting urine is through these installations, which we've procured a permitting pathway for in Vermont. Now Vermont is unique in that for home toilets, it doesn't require the toilet to be approved by the Vermont Plumbing Board, as opposed to public toilets, which is different from other states, as I understand it. But which means that we can install things like this Vostman EcoFlush, which is a European toilet that has a divided bowl, so that the front half of the toilet diverts urine to a tank in the basement, and the back half can either flush to your sewer or septic system, or there are dry models of this, like the Separate, where the back half can be connected to a compost toilet. But rules and regulations for these kinds of toilets vary state by state, and I think figuring out the pathway in Massachusetts will be a different matter. We do also install in businesses these waterless urinals, which enable us to collect urine from public businesses in a permitted way. Currently, we're only permitted for these waterless urinals in public bathrooms. So that's our main method for that. This one is a picture of our urinal in the Hermit Thrush Brewery in Brattleboro. So if you're ever in Brattleboro and want to Peecycle, you can take a stop off at the brewery and contribute there. And then we do also have a permit for these hand carry systems, which are essentially barrels inside secondary containment that folks can bring their full QB out to, and then with a spout transfer the urine into these containers. So this is some pictures of a pump out from a home installation. There's Arthur there with our connector, so that we can just come with our truck and essentially from the outside of a home connect to the barrel of urine inside their basement and just pump out the nutrients and carry them away. Sort of like the inverse of getting your oil delivered. You just get your nutrients extracted. And then so once we've collected the urine from these different means, we then transport the urine back from the collection points to our processing center, which is at our research center. And this is a picture of our primary transport vehicle, which is basically just like any old truck you would find anywhere, except that it's retrofitted with a vacuum pump, which enables us to transfer the liquid much more easily. Yeah, so then once it's at our research center, we pasteurize the urine, which somehow now I'm missing a slide on the pasteurization. But I think we may come back to that at a future slide. But I'll talk about it now in case we don't get to it, which is at our research center, once we've transported the urine there, we pasteurize it with a custom designed pasteurizer that has been developed over the years to be highly energy efficient and is now marketed by a spin-off company called Brightwater Tools. So I'll make sure to tell you more about the pasteurizer if we don't get to it at a future slide. So then once our urine is sanitized, we bring it to local farms to apply on their farmland. And we've partnered with about 9 different farm partners over the years. And we're always trialing urine on new crops and with new application methods. But these are just some examples of farms we've partnered with. And one of the early farm experiments we did was comparing the effect of urine fertilizer on increasing hay yield as compared with synthetic fertilizer. And we found that it really can have the same impact on increasing growth. And this is one of many USDA SARE grants that we've gotten over the years, which is Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, to fund our work partnering with farmers and exploring urine as an effective fertilizer. This is another one of our farm partners. This is over at Pete's stand. We fertilized some sweet corn. And just today, Arthur was back there this year fertilizing some more corn. So we're continuing that partnership and continuing to explore urine fertilizer methods for their corn. And then this is down at Yellowbud Farm, which is in Northfield. And we were fertilizing some nursery tree crop with actually using the same applicator we use for hay farmers. For the hay fields, but it just happened to work out great for the size of rows they had for their nursery crop. And Arthur, feel free to chime in here if you'd like to share anything else about farm partnerships.
Great, I will do so.
Okay. I'm hopeful that I have a pasteurizer slide coming up, but if not, I will maybe take us on a field trip to the Brightwater website. And so just as we continue on with different ways of using urine as a fertilizer, this is a picture of our vermiponic system that was designed by an organization based in California called Dark Nectar Cooperative. And this essentially uses worm tea from worms in these drawers that decompose compost and combining that with pasteurized urine into the system. And the nutrient makeup of those two sources makes just kind of a perfect match for growing lettuce in this water-based system. And this is kind of an intriguing model to explore, especially as we think about scaling up for urban contexts where a lot of urine is, as one might imagine, accumulated in cities in the US. And so trying to think about how that could match make with different urban agriculture techniques, so you're not having to transport large volumes of urine across the country. Just kind of an interesting thing to explore and has been, seemed to be highly productive in our research center here. All right, so I think I will pause and just take us on a field trip to check out the pasteurizer. Somehow I have missed that slide. So the important middle step of our treatment of our community scale process is sanitizing the urine. So as I mentioned, in the community scale program, it's really important to pasteurize the urine so that it can meet US EPA requirements, which is actually requirements that were set or outlined for biosolids that come out of a wastewater treatment plant. But we follow those same guidelines for our urine because there's no kind of separate legal classification for urine. Though our regulators in Vermont do recognize that urine is a separate substance from biosolids that come out of a wastewater treatment plant, and kind of we've worked with them to figure out a permitting pathway accordingly. But essentially, it's a heat and time pasteurizer, which heats urine to about 90 degrees Celsius for, oh no, I'm forgetting my numbers. Arthur, do you have the Celsius and the seconds?
Yeah, it's about 80 degrees Celsius for about a minute and a half, 90 seconds or so.
Okay, 80 for 90. I always get those flipped sometimes. So that's how that works. And it uses a heat transfer system, so that essentially as the hot urine is leaving the pasteurizer, it can transfer the heat to the cold urine that's entering the pasteurizer. And in total uses about the same amount of energy as one incandescent light bulb. So this could potentially live at a urine depot wherever future urine depots may be. All right, let us continue on. So now we'll shift gears and talk about what urine reclamation could look like potentially in Franklin County. And before we do, I think it's really important to acknowledge the huge amount of work that different people throughout Massachusetts have been doing on the ecological sanitation front. Down in Cape Cod, there's been a lot of progress lately on getting a urine diversion pilot going. And we have partners at the Green Center, formerly the New Alchemy Institute, Hilda and Earl, who've been doing a lot of work on that, as well as the Falmouth Pond Coalition, Mass TC, and even the Fibershed project doing some explorations into urine fertilized dye plants. And then in Western Mass, many people we know who have also been involved in this movement, everywhere from the compost toilet at Grow Food Northampton, which we had the pleasure of taking a field trip to last year, which diverts urine, to Nutrient Networks and Ben Goldberg and Yellowbud Farm, which we did the application at earlier this year, and then the Garlic and Arts Festival as well, and many, many more. So to get us started, we're going to kind of go through some slides of some different aspects to consider for starting a community scale program, and what we're looking for partners to help provide, and what Rich Earth Institute can do to support partners in getting a program going. And then we'd love to hear your thoughts about different pieces of this puzzle you see potentially coming together for this. So one big aspect to consider, of course, is funding. And there's a potential for a funding source from the Long Island Sound study, which funds efforts that mitigate nutrient pollution in the Long Island Sound, as we mentioned with some of Rich Earth's own programming. And so we're kind of trying to build together a coalition of folks who could potentially create a project design for one of their planning grants that would come out in the fall. And to do this, we can support with the kind of grant development process, and also any support for actually implementing that planning project as well. So then for collection of the urine, the big thing to think about is where actually would a urine depot somewhere in Franklin County be sited. There are a few different factors to consider for that, including we want it to be a site that would largely be a net, would be an energy efficient kind of place to site a urine depot. So we don't want people driving from far and wide carrying their urine specifically for the urine recycling project and then kind of having a net increase in carbon emissions. So somewhere that people are already traveling would be ideal, and somewhere where there's a high concentration of people who would potentially contribute to a urine depot as well. And I'll pass it to Tatiana to talk a little bit about the community engagement component of collection now.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Yeah, so it's important to, and when thinking about, getting started on a project like this, to think about how you want to engage the community from very early on in the process, to kind of ensure that people are understanding what's being involved and have an opportunity to participate in conversations about it, sort of as a way of building support, and also responding to any questions and concerns that people might have. So, we have done a lot of that over the years with our project, and that's included doing outreach to donors and potential donors, providing them education, like the type of education Julia's doing here in explaining what it's all about, and providing support for people who want to get involved, and then facilitating community conversations with local leaders and community members, advocates, anybody who might have questions or concerns. And so you can also use that to sort of to learn what questions and concerns you might not have even thought of as you get started. And therefore you can then address those concerns as you get moving forward with the project. If you want to add more to that, Julia.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tatiana.
Sure.
So yeah, we're interested in finding partners who can help with some of that community engagement work and helping do that organizing. And then of course, we can also support with a lot of the educational materials and resources we already have and kind of lessons learned from how we've done community engagement in our community as well. And then in terms of what we can do to support the urine depot, we can facilitate the depot construction and training any maintenance or operator staff. And we'll have a slide on kind of staffing later. And then we can also provide the urine collectors that I was showing earlier, the gallon containers and the funnel. So then to treatment, there are a few different places that treatment could happen. And namely, this means a few different places where a pasteurizer could be sited. So one option is you could have a pasteurizer at the urine depot so that it can be kind of continuously pasteurizing urine that's being collected there into sanitized containers that could then be pumped out and brought directly to a farm. And so the nice thing about that option is that once the urine's pasteurized, it's considered a fertilizer product and you don't need a special permit to transport the urine across town lines. In Massachusetts, you do need a special permit when it's considered urine, which is considered a biosolid. You need a special permit for every town you're going to travel through. So that can be a little bit challenging from a logistical perspective. But another option for siting the pasteurizer could be at a farm. So you could transport the urine from the depot to a farm and then have it pasteurize there as well. And so
I can jump in and talk.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that citing the pasteurizer in a place where it would make sense in terms of where if someone's going to, if this project ended up being kind of more led by through like through a farm, say, then maybe it would make sense for that piece of equipment to be more based at the farm where there's someone who could be more looking after it and operating it. If it's going to be more at a place through some kind of municipal partnership at, say, a transfer station recycling center, then maybe it makes more sense for it to be there. I think it could kind of go a number of ways, and I think it really depends on the type of collaboration that comes about. But certainly we would be excited to consult on the possibilities.
Yeah, thanks, Arthur. Lots of different kind of options of how exactly what could be where and how that could work. So then for transport, there are a few different options as well. One thing that Rich Earth did in the early years before we had our special P truck pictured here was we partnered with septic haulers, which is nice since they can kind of already have some of the permits that might be required for transporting the urine. Another option, as Arthur mentioned, especially if it's a more kind of farm partner led project, could be having the farm partner go and pick up the urine, which could potentially be easier if the pasteurizer, there are a few different options of how that could look, essentially. And one option is if the project is kind of getting going in the early years or in the first year, Rich Earth could come down with our truck and help transport it from point of collection to the farm for application. and then transition to having a partner be the transporter, or some different combination of options. But that's one way we could support.
Yeah, and I guess I would also just want to say, you know, all of these things are kind of things that we have thought of either based on our experience of what we do up here in the Brattleboro area, or other ways that we've imagined you know, a system like this could work. But I think that, you know, this is all like what we're talking about right now is like kind of trying to gather support for doing a planning project, not even doing an implementation project, but starting a planning project. So all of these conversations, I think, would need to happen further on down the line, obviously, with people who are going to be, you know, some of the organizers, whether that's any of you here on this call or others who maybe were at our call last week, or people who aren't.
Yeah, and I'll share this at the end as well, but we have a form where you can kind of indicate what potential role you see yourself having, or what other ideas you have as well, so we can kind of help continue on the conversation and figure out what pieces we might want to pull together for a potential planning grant. So then for farm application, of course, it's important to identify a farm partner who ideally is located close to where the urine is being collected. And one thing that we found to be useful in our program is having some on-farm demonstrations of urine as a fertilizer. And then obtaining the right application equipment for the farm is important as well. So on both of those points, we're actually in the process of creating a farm guide to help farmers think about using urine as a fertilizer and provide information about that. So that should be out by the time we have this project going. And then we can support with figuring out application methods as well, because that's something we've been doing a lot of through these USDA farm partnership grants, and collaborating with farmers on that is something Arthur does a lot. All right, so then for all of these things, we kind of need to think about what pathway for staffing there might be, because all of these things require some amount of work, and Rich Earth can support training people on these components, but we're hoping to kind of seed a program that can eventually be sort of self-sustaining outside of us. And so that involves having people who can hold some of these different components themselves. So one component of that is the urine collection side, which includes urine donor recruitment and support, and then also some of that community engagement work Tatiana was talking about, and then also depot maintenance and equipment maintenance at the depot. And then for treatment, someone needs to generally oversee the pasteurization and also partake in regulatory reporting to the state for any requirements by the permit that the pasteurizer would ultimately have. And then someone who can coordinate the transport, bringing the urine to the farm, and generally coordinating getting the urine from one place to another. And then partnering with farmers and coordinating farm application. So then, as I've mentioned, figuring out the regulatory pathway is going to be a big part of, if we do go for a planning grant with partners, figuring out what that pathway could look like. So there does not yet exist a clear permitting pathway for community urine recycling, specifically in Massachusetts. So that would be something that we and community partners would need to collaborate with both the Mass DEP and also local town boards of health to identify a regulatory pathway that could make sense for this kind of community program. So here you can see the timeline of what our kind of permitting journey has been like in Brattleboro. And being collaborative and in open communication with our regulators, and kind of having our permitting pathway grow as our community program grows has been an important part of our journey on that front. And so we believe that we can kind of use some of the lessons learned from this experience, and also some of our regulatory collaborators in Mass, to figure out a new pathway that could make sense for everyone. All right, so that's the end of our kind of main slides. A few things I just want to mention before we shift into discussion are one, this Peecycling community interest form that we've created so that folks can let us know what their interest is in urine reclamation, specifically in your local geography in Franklin County, in this case, and then what potential roles or ideas or opportunities you see for this or motivations for it. So I'll share a link to this in a follow-up email and also in the chat, but it's just tinyurl.com/peecycle near me. So we'd love for you all to take that and let us know your thoughts about Peecycling in Franklin County. And then the next thing I'll just mention is we have a summit coming up in early November, which is a great opportunity to come and actually tour our community program here in Brattleboro. We'll have a little bus tour going around to see all those different 4 steps. In addition to presentations and panels from researchers around the world looking at urine recycling from different angles. So we're hoping to have a Long Island watershed, Connecticut River and Long Island Sound watershed specific workshop as part of this summit. And we'll share more details about that as it forms. So if you register for the summit or continue to check that website, details will be posted there. All right, so now we'd love to shift into a little bit of discussion around some of these questions, including depot siting, what potential locations you think might be a good idea, what key community partnerships you think might be important to cultivate for growing a program like this, other people we should reach out to, some different approaches to meeting the staffing needs, ideas you have about where we could kind of fill in some of those different pieces. And then what community outreach strategies could be key for launching a Peecycling program in Franklin County. And then, of course, also, if you have any questions or other ideas you'd like to share, now is the time. So, yeah, feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute and let us know your thoughts. Yeah, Glenn, love to hear your thoughts.
Hi. Yeah, I live in Greenfield, and it's raining right now, a little bit outside. But I don't know if you've noticed in the newspapers, it's been reported that just recently, whenever it rains more than an inch or two, the city of Greenfield flushes millions of gallons of partially treated and untreated wastewater into the Deerfield River, right in very close to the Connecticut River. And that's actually been happening for 20 years, probably. I know I looked a few years ago, I looked at the EPA database, and the wastewater treatment plant here had been in non-compliance every quarter for 12 years. I haven't looked recently, but we're under a consent agreement, a consent order right now with Mass DEP to fix our combined sewer overflow system and the really significant inflow problem that we have here. So my question is, I don't know if you're aware of that, but you know, you're dealing with the largest community in Franklin County, Greenfield, that is also an environmental justice community as well, predominantly. So I'm just wondering, is there funding for a community effort from the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or from the Inflation Reduction Act? Because that's supposed to be providing, you know, billions of dollars for wastewater infrastructure improvements. And, you know, we haven't had that since Ronald Reagan took over the government, 40 years ago or more. So I'm just curious, is there some significant funding available from the federal government? Because the infrastructure really is so outdated. We don't have nutrient removal here in Greenfield, you know, and obviously that's what you're talking about, but our wastewater treatment system does not remove nutrients. It was never intended to. It's not designed for that. So is that too big of a question, or do we need to start smaller?
I think it's not too big of a question to be asking, certainly. I think that in terms of where our work comes in, I think that I don't think we have done any looking around about how the Inflation Reduction Act money is being dispersed in the state of Massachusetts. Or at least I haven't, and I'm not aware that anyone else at Rich Earth has either. But certainly I think that is one of the things that I've heard that money could be used for, that kind of thing. Brattleboro also doesn't do nutrient removal at its wastewater treatment plant. I think most, small, fairly, small communities, of which I would consider, Greenfield and Brattleboro, even though we're, the bigger communities around in our area, we're still fairly small communities, and small wastewater treatment plants. It is a large investment, as you mentioned, to put in that kind of infrastructure. So I would certainly think that, I think that would be a great thing to happen. I think it's a little bit of a kind of like a parallel project in terms of what we're talking about as well. I think that, I'm also under no illusion that I think probably, starting a community scale urine recycling program in the Franklin County area, centered likely around, Greenfield, Turner's Falls area, that would be a drop in the bucket in terms of the, the nutrients that are flowing, from human, at least in the short term, from the, human society into the river. But I think that it's a place to start, and I think that it has, the potential to grow. And I think the nice thing about it is that it also, has this beneficial reuse aspect that, taking stuff out at the wastewater treatment plant doesn't have.
Yeah.
And it's also a lot less expensive to get off the ground. Certainly.
Yeah. I think that's kind of part of our approach of how we've been thinking about some of the work we're supporting down in the Cape Cod area, where they have a lot of also nutrient pollution problems there. And, urine diversion can be a relatively affordable and kind of quick way of starting to divert nutrients and keep them out of our watersheds right now. But at the same time as some kind of larger infrastructure needs to be put in place for these kind of larger issues than what just a community recycling program, Peecycling program could offer. So we kind of see it as a companion to other nutrient removal or wastewater solution approaches. And I think it's a little bit of a challenge in terms of how wastewater funding happens in the US, where we have these large kind of waves of funding for wastewater improvement every 50 years or something. And where kind of the development of technology for full kind of on-site human waste reuse and recycling sits right now, in terms of, we can't provide a full kind of toilet and gray water solution for a home with the technology that we currently have, or that we're kind of set up to be able to offer. But that kind of thing is what the funding would for in terms of like the ARPA funding that's available for wastewater solutions. Urine diversion isn't kind of the full sanitation solution that those funding sources were set up to fund, if that makes sense. But yeah.
I just wanted to address a couple of the things in the chat. Steve had a question which is related to this, and I just wanted to clarify that for others who may not be aware. Wastewater treatment sometimes removes nitrogen and phosphorus from sewage that goes to, and wastewater generally that goes to the wastewater treatment plant, but not always. And as I mentioned, I would say a lot of small and medium wastewater treatment plants do not. I know that increasingly a number of larger ones do. Like I believe I'm fairly sure that like Hartford, Connecticut's wastewater treatment plant does do nutrient removal. but a lot of smaller plants don't. If that helps, Steve, in your understanding of that, that's great.
Any other questions or comments from folks, either about kind of Peecycling more broadly or about some different ideas of potential sites or strategies for Franklin County? Yeah, go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, so here in Greenfield, which again is the largest community in Franklin County, you know, the county seat, but we don't have county government anymore. But there is the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, where I used to work as the regional health agent, and you know that's an organization full of planners, you know, which seems like that would be an ideal place for you all to tap into. Here, we also have a pretty active food co-op in Greenfield, which would have the kind of people that would be interested in this idea. And then we also have a large farmers cooperative, you know, that sells fertilizer. So, you know, that's also another potential contact. And then we have a community farm, Just Roots, where you know, this could be a perfect fit for the folks that run that place as well. And you know, that would be another good people to talk to about this. And anyway, but you know, those are some of the community areas. But at this point, I don't think you would get anywhere talking with our existing Board of Health. Unfortunately. And I don't expect that the DPW, Department of Public Works, would be interested in participating unless they were ordered to do so by the DEP. And I don't see that happening at the state level. But like you started with, you know, at the beginning, more than 10 years ago, I think that here in Massachusetts, it would be a meeting with the commissioner. There's a new commissioner at DEP. There's a new administration here in Massachusetts that is bound to be a lot more enlightened than the previous. I can't say it in public. Administration. So, you know, I think that would be a good place to start. And there are people that are working on trying to tap into the federal funding because, you know, again, we have 40 or 50 years of completely unfunded infrastructure needs in water and wastewater here in the Commonwealth. So, you know, those folks should be involved in this kind of discussion because why should we be spending millions, tens of millions of dollars to only put in nutrient removal at the wastewater treatment plants when we could be diverting those nutrients to start with from the waste stream? You know, it's a no-brainer, but you know, that's not the way the system has been traditionally designed. The engineers have found the solution at the end of the pipe instead of at the beginning, you know, which is the problem. Obviously, you know that.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that you know, we're aware that you know, some people are going to be highly supportive of this and other people aren't. And that's why it would be really valuable when starting a project like this to try to engage, you know, all the people, including the people who may be concerned or opposed. And, you know, one way to do that would be to schedule meetings with people individually, the individual people that need to be involved, and just have an interview or a facilitated kind of conversation with them to find out what are their concerns, and just to hear them out, to have kind of a listening session with different people. And then another, so that's what we did at the beginning of this project. We had a research project where we did interviews with all kinds of people who could be involved, from wastewater treatment operators to people on planning boards and legislators and all kinds of people just to hear what their concerns were or what their ideas and recommendations were as well. And then another approach is something we call a dialogue group, or you could call it a community conversation or listening session, where you try to bring people together who may have different points of view and have a conversation and hear and allow them to see if their assumptions about each other and their perspectives are correct, and challenge one another and see if that can help to move things forward. What I'm trying to say is I don't think it has to be confrontational. It could be more of just trying to hear people out and understanding their different perspectives and hopefully move forward in dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits of doing a planning grant project, is kind of having that time to do collaboration and figure out what people's concerns and ideas are. Sarah, do you have a hand?
Hi. I'm wondering what the most low-key start is, because I feel like Nina Nina's in the Zoom as well. We're working on a free store in Greenfield, and it's at this warehouse, and it's pretty near downtown. And it's could we just have you guys come out and people can buy jugs from you, and then people can just bring their jugs there, and we have a truck and a trailer and we can just bring it there. I'm just wondering, not as a long-term urine depot, but just to get people whatever, thinking about it, talking about it, people meeting each other. So what would you picture as the most low-key beginning, before a grant and planning a urine depot?
Well, I think one approach we've taken is kind of supporting people in doing this in their home gardening practice to begin with, because anything larger than that triggers some of these kind of permitting and regulatory questions that Glenn was alluding to, brings in a little more complexity in terms of permitting and storage and treatment and all of those things. But if you want to use urine in your own home garden at the small scale, that's possible anytime, anywhere, and there are World Health Organization guidelines about that. So we have our home garden education program, which we call Urine My Garden, which includes a home garden guide and classes or workshops that we offer. And so that could be one way to start getting people using these urine collectors that we were showing. And so one idea is, if you wanted to start kind of having those urine collectors at your free store, for example, and having folks kind of take them home and start using them in their home gardens, then they can kind of be already primed for the pump, so to speak, of when we might have a urine depot that they could actually then start contributing to on the community scale sometime in the future.
So being a reseller of the jugs is what you're saying?
Potentially, yeah, or a distribution site.
Yeah, distribution
could be an option. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to explore. Yeah, it's exciting to hear about a potential free store there. That would be awesome. All right, well, we are just about at 8, so I think I'll close this out for now, but definitely I'll put in the chat, here is the link to our community interest form. So we'd love everyone to share your ideas or questions or further connections through that form. And then we'll also be hosting more meetings and planning calls, and this is just kind of the beginning of a long conversation, and hopefully lots of collaborations down in Franklin County. And then also just posting our summit website here. So if you want to come up to Brattleboro and see our program, and we're hoping to have a kind of Franklin County cohort as part of the summit, especially for that Connecticut River Watershed workshop we'll have as part of the summit. If we didn't get to your comment right now, we can reach out to you after the webinar. And feel free to email us with any other questions you have. And yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming to this conversation. And definitely we look forward to continuing it with you in the coming weeks and months.
See ya.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Julia, I'm answering one more question in the chat, so
Oh, okay, I will
leave it
leave
for a
us here
moment.
for a moment. Yeah.
There was a question on